war fought in the shadow of empires, where small bands of farmers held their ground against the might of the British Empire. The Boer Wars were a brutal struggle, largely forgotten by history, but the scars they left on South Africa and the world are undeniable, shaping nations and ideologies for generations. Fought between the British Empire and Dutch-descended settlers in South Africa, this conflict would have lasting repercussions, not just for South Africa, but for the entire world. With devastating battles, a legacy of suffering, and the rise of deep-seated nationalism, the Boer Wars left an indelible mark on history. Few understand the true scope of the war's human cost. Over 100,000 civilians, mostly women and children, died in horrific conditions in British-run concentration camps. Despite this, the history of the Boer Wars remains largely forgotten. What is often overlooked is the profound influence these wars had on shaping the political landscape that led to the rise of apartheid and other enduring legacies of racial segregation. In this video, we delve into the forgotten struggle of the Boer Wars, unearthing the hidden stories and the shocking legacy they left behind. We'll explore how this brutal war impacted South Africa's formation, how it shaped global military strategy, and how its consequences continue to affect the world today. To understand the Boer Wars, it's essential to know who the Boers were and why they fought so fiercely against the British. The Boers, or Afrikaners, were descendants of Dutch settlers who had established a colony in South Africa in the 17th century. They had lived under Dutch rule for generations, but by the late 18th century, the British had taken control of the region. Tensions began to simmer as the British introduced new policies that the Boers resented. These included restrictions on their culture, the imposition of English as the official language, and the abolition of slavery, which disrupted the Boer economy. The discovery of gold and diamonds in the late 19th century in the Transvaal, a Boer republic, added a combustible element to the situation. The British Empire, seeing the wealth and strategic importance of South Africa, began to move aggressively to take control of these resources. The Boers, determined to protect their independence and way of life, resisted British expansion. What followed was a clash of two worlds: British imperialism, seeking to expand its global reach, and the Boers, fiercely protective of their land, culture, and freedom. The first conflict, the First Boer War, 1880 to 1881, was an unexpected turn in this battle for control. The British, confident of victory, were caught off guard by the guerrilla tactics of the Boers. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the Boers managed to inflict heavy losses on the British forces. The war ended with the Boers achieving a surprising victory, securing their independence in the Transvaal. However, this victory didn't end British ambitions. Tensions simmered, and the stage was set for an even more brutal conflict. The stage was set for a much larger and far more destructive conflict: the Second Boer War, which began in 1899. The British Empire, determined to secure control over the gold-rich Transvaal and other Boer territories, launched an aggressive campaign to crush the Boer republics once and for all. However, what the British did not anticipate was the fierce resistance they would face from the Boers, who were now better prepared and more determined than ever. The war was marked by the use of guerrilla warfare by the Boers, who knew the terrain and could mobilize quickly. Their tactics were highly effective, using small, mobile units that harassed British troops, disrupted supply lines, and targeted vulnerable outposts. The Boers were not an organized army, but a collection of fiercely independent farmers, and this allowed them to fight in a way that was nearly impossible for the larger, more conventional British forces to combat. In response, the British adapted their strategy, resorting to more brutal measures, including scorched earth tactics. Entire villages were burned to the ground, and farmsteads were destroyed. This was part of the British strategy to cut off Boer support by eliminating their resources. Yet, this would be a strategy that would backfire, as it only deepened the resolve of the Boers and further alienated the local civilian population. The British also introduced concentration camps, a tactic that would be forever linked to the Boer War. These camps were initially intended to house Boer civilians who had been displaced by the British military operations. However, the camps became overcrowded and the conditions were horrific. Disease and malnutrition claimed the lives of over 100,000 civilians, most of them women and children. The camps have since become a symbol of the brutal nature of the war and the callousness of the British military response. Despite the strategic successes and moral victories of the Boers, the British Empire had the upper hand in terms of resources and military might. By 1902, after 3 years of brutal fighting, the war ended with the Treaty of Vereeniging. The Boers had to accept British sovereignty, but in return, they were allowed to retain certain political rights. The war's conclusion set the stage for a unified South Africa under British control, yet the deep divisions and resentment between the Boers and the British would continue to fester for decades. The Second Boer War is often remembered for its strategic importance and the eventual political ramifications. But it was also a profoundly brutal conflict, with a human cost that is still not fully recognized. The use of concentration camps by the British was one of the war's most horrifying chapters. While they were initially intended to house the displaced Boer civilians and deny the enemy any support, the reality inside these camps was far worse. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and a lack of proper nutrition led to disease outbreaks, including typhoid fever, dysentery, and malaria. The camps became breeding grounds for death. The exact number of civilian deaths remains a topic of debate, but estimates suggest that between 20,000 to 30,000 Boers died in these camps, while many more Black South Africans also suffered and perished in camps under similar conditions, though their deaths have been historically underreported. The overwhelming majority of the dead were women and children who had been forced from their homes and placed in these appalling conditions. The loss of life, particularly among the vulnerable, left deep emotional scars in the Boer community. For the Boers, this was not just a military defeat, it was a cultural and emotional tragedy. Families were torn apart, communities devastated, and the trauma experienced during the war was felt for generations. Even as the British forces emerged victorious on the battlefield, they had created a bitter, resentful population in the Boers, one that would give rise to an intense sense of Afrikaner nationalism and a desire to reclaim their independence. These sentiments would ultimately influence the course of South African politics in the 20th century. The brutality of the war was not limited to the treatment of Boer civilians. The British soldiers, too, suffered the harsh realities of warfare. Poor leadership, logistical failures, and the inability to adapt to guerrilla tactics meant that British forces faced humiliating setbacks. In addition to the military challenges, the war strained British morale and resources, and many began to question whether the costs of fighting the Boers were truly worth it. In the end, the human cost of the Boer War was incalculable. Beyond the death toll, the psychological trauma and the scars left on the Boers and their descendants shaped their future. The emotional and physical toll would not only influence the formation of modern South Africa, but also sow the seeds of an eventual conflict that would come to define the country's racial politics: apartheid. Though the Second Boer War officially ended in 1902 with the signing of the Treaty of Vereeniging, the consequences of the conflict stretched far beyond the battlefield. The war's aftermath would play a critical role in shaping the political and social landscape of South Africa for the rest of the 20th century. First and foremost, the war's end marked the beginning of British control over South Africa, consolidating the various Boer republics into a single British-controlled Union of South Africa in 1910. However, rather than leading to a peaceful resolution, the Boer victory over the British ignited a deep resentment and a hunger for political power. The Boer leadership, deeply scarred by the war, would begin to embrace a vision of Afrikaner nationalism, a vision that called for the preservation of Boer identity, culture, and language, and the protection of their rights in a British-dominated South Africa. This shift towards nationalism laid the foundation for what would later become apartheid. Although it wasn't immediately apparent in the years following the war, the policies that would institutionalize racial segregation began to take shape in the aftermath of the conflict. The political landscape was marked by a sense of fear and distrust between the British and the Boers, but also between the Boers and the black South Africans who had suffered throughout the war, particularly under British military control. The war had irrevocably shaped how South Africa would evolve, creating the divisions that would dominate the nation's future. On a global scale, the Boer War had significant implications for the British Empire's military and political strategy. The war exposed the limits of British imperial power and showed that even the mightiest empire could be challenged by a small, determined enemy using unconventional tactics. The use of guerrilla warfare by the Boers influenced military strategies in future conflicts, including World War I, and introduced the concept of total war, which targeted both military and civilian resources. But the most enduring legacy of the Boer War was the deep-seated sense of injustice felt by the Boer community. The war's brutality, particularly the treatment of civilians in concentration camps, fostered a strong desire for revenge and a long-lasting bitterness towards the British. Over time, this resentment fueled the rise of the National Party, which would eventually come to power in 1948, ushering in the era of apartheid, a brutal policy of racial segregation that would dominate South Africa for decades. While the war itself may have ended, the scars it left on the people of South Africa, both Boer and black, would never fully heal. The conflict's legacy would remain at the heart of the struggle for equality and justice in the nation for much of the 20th century, shaping the political and cultural identity of South Africa in ways that are still felt today. Despite its enormous impact on the shaping of South Africa and the British Empire, the Boer War is often overlooked in discussions of global history. Unlike the two world wars that followed, which garnered widespread attention, the Boer War has faded from public consciousness. So why has this devastating conflict been largely forgotten? One major reason lies in the dominance of larger historical narratives. The early 20th century was defined by the First and Second World Wars, and much of the historical focus was on these global conflicts. The Boer War, though significant, didn't have the same wide-reaching international consequences as those wars. As a result, its stories, particularly the trauma faced by civilians and the complexities of Boer resistance, were overshadowed by the sheer scale of later global battles. Another factor in its relative obscurity is the role of imperialism. The British Empire, in its quest for global dominance, sought to downplay any conflicts that might tarnish its image. The atrocities committed during the Boer War, particularly the use of concentration camps, were controversial even at the time. Yet these actions were often minimized or ignored in official British accounts, and the story of the war was largely sanitized in many Western historical narratives. This silencing of the Boer War's true horrors led to a significant gap in global awareness, and in many places, the conflict simply wasn't discussed in detail. Moreover, the Boer War's legacy was also shaped by the politics of South Africa in the decades that followed. When the National Party came to power in 1948 and instituted the policy of apartheid, the historical narrative around the Boer War was manipulated to support the segregationist policies that were being put in place. By focusing on the victimhood of the Boers and framing the war as a struggle for independence from British colonialism, apartheid leaders sought to foster Afrikaner nationalism and legitimize the racial policies that would follow. This narrow interpretation of the war left little room for a more balanced discussion of its broader impacts. Finally, there is a lingering issue of historical erasure, especially regarding the African perspective on the war. While the conflict was devastating for the Boer population, it also had a severe impact on black South Africans, many of whom were forced into labor for the British or suffered under the same brutal conditions in the concentration camps. The experiences of black South Africans during the Boer War have often been marginalized, both at the time and in subsequent historical discussions. This erasure of their suffering has contributed to the war's incomplete legacy and the lack of awareness surrounding its full impact. In essence, the Boer War's relative obscurity can be attributed to a combination of global historical priorities, imperial narratives, political manipulation, and racial silencing. Its true significance has been buried, but the wounds it left behind are still felt in South Africa today. The Boer War, though often overlooked in history, left behind a legacy that is still visible in South Africa today. The suffering and the divisions created by this brutal conflict laid the groundwork for the apartheid system that would come to define the nation for much of the 20th century. The war's aftermath, marked by Afrikaner nationalism and a desire for political power, shaped South Africa's future, with deep implications not only for its own people, but for the entire global political landscape. In the years following the war, the Boer victory over the British sowed the seeds of a new South African identity. One that sought to preserve Afrikaner culture and language, but also one that would eventually play a central role in the racial segregation policies that would dominate the country. The apartheid system, which institutionalized racial inequality and discrimination, found its roots in the nationalistic fervor that emerged from the Boer War's aftermath. Yet, the war's legacy isn't solely about division and suffering. It's a reminder of how deeply a nation's history can shape its present. Modern South Africa, with its efforts to move beyond apartheid and build a more inclusive society, has begun to confront the painful legacies of its past. The history of the Boer War, particularly the experiences of those who lived through it, is an essential part of understanding how South Africa arrived at where it is today. This conflict, often forgotten in mainstream global history, is a powerful reminder of the long-lasting effects of war on individuals, communities, and nations. It's a call for us to examine not only the conflicts that dominate our history books, but also the lesser-known struggles that have shaped the world in ways we often overlook. Understanding the full legacy of the Boer War is crucial to fully grasping the social, political, and racial tensions that continue to impact South Africa and other parts of the world. The Boer War may have ended over a century ago, but its legacy is far from over. As we reflect on this forgotten struggle, we are reminded of the importance of remembering all parts of history, especially those that have been overshadowed by the more dominant narratives. Only by understanding the past can we truly move forward into a future of reconciliation and healing.